Good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining us here today. My name is Reed Blakemore, and I'm the Director of Research and Programs here at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I'm thrilled for you to join us here for a conversation on the opportunity for the North American Trilateral to be an engine for energy security, economic competitiveness, and sustainability. As the global energy system evolves and transforms in response to increasing energy demand, geopolitical challenges, and the imperative of climate action, a landscape of new energy security concerns, geoeconomic competition, and prosperity paradigms are emerging. And to navigate these shifts, trusted, resilient value chains are crucial. The question now confronting the United States, Canada, and Mexico is whether a signal for strategic alignment has emerged to improve the resilience of energy value chains, strengthen the long-term security and sustainability of our shared energy systems, and boost our competitiveness in new energy technology markets through enhanced North American energy cooperation. Meanwhile, the alignment of major elections in Mexico City, Washington, and Ottawa over a short 13-month period leading up to a review of the USMCA in 2026 poses an important opportunity to explore this idea of a North American energy opportunity. Indeed, elections can bring just as many uncertainties as they do opportunities, but the uniqueness of this moment is why I'm particularly pleased to host this event as a kickoff to the Global Energy Center's work on the pathways through which North America can improve its collaboration and coordination on energy security, economic competitiveness, and energy transition. For those interested, we just this afternoon released a short paper from the Global Energy Center, co-authored by my colleagues Elena Karpin and Chase Tallheimer, to complement the beginning of our work on this subject. That paper is available on the Atlantic Council website. So, with that all said, and a little bit of shameless self-promotion, I'll admit, let's dive in. Our focus today is to identify the main opportunities that come with a new political era as we look to formulate a tangible path forward for North American energy collaboration. To do so, I'm joined here today in person and virtually by three experts who can speak to these issue sets across the continent. First to my left, Julia Nesheiwat, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and Vice President of Policy and Insights at TC Energy. Further on down the line, Dr. Liliana Diaz, Adjunct Lecturer in Latin American Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And joining us virtually, Heather Exner-Pirot, Senior Fellow and Director of Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We have somebody representing each part of the trilateral, and I think we'll deal with each part of that trilateral individually. Before I jump in, as a reminder, this event is live and on the record. To those in the audience watching, you can submit questions throughout the discussion using the Ask AC function. To do so, please visit askac.org and select the event titled North America's Moment, and we'll try to incorporate your questions over the course of the session. With those logistical items taken care of, let me turn to Julia as our first panelist. Let's talk about what we see as the United States' role in a North American energy opportunity. From your perspective, what is that role and what are the opportunities and perhaps challenges that define that role?
Thank you so much, Reed. And again, it's such a pleasure to be here with the Atlantic Council. Thank you to all the organizers for putting this together. It's just a thrill to be here with my colleagues today. The fact that we're just having this discussion on North America, you would think that it's something that has been done over and over in the past, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, we tend to not think as regionally as we should and more bilaterally at times. But that being said, you know, at the end of the day, while Canada, the United States, and Mexico have their own unique energy policies, it's important that we work together, think about what those complementary assets are to really expand upon the North America case, if you will. With regards to the United States, my goodness, you know, just thinking back over a decade ago, my time as a diplomat at the State Department, we were looking at imports of oil and gas in the United States. And to now fast forward to today, it's just remarkable how we are now the largest oil and gas exporter, producer in the world. So we've come such a long way when it comes to energy security, both in North America as well as globally, when you think about it. And while it is important to think about having I'd call an all of the above strategy with all energy sources that are out there. It's important to think about the aspect of sustainability, the aspect of affordability, reliability, and at the end of the day, natural gas is where the crux of it all comes to. And we have such an abundance in North America and in particular in the United States. In fact, at TC, we are the only company that actually provides gas to Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And so I think it's important, again, just to kind of walk the walk and not just talk the talk when it comes to providing those energy resources. So that being said, again, the fact that we went through a shale gas revolution 15 years ago, now that we are able to export more than ever when it comes to LNG, the need today because of what's happening around the world, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or even in the Middle East, around the Red Sea, our shipping, our trade. The U.S. is certainly a major player and will continue to be, but it is certainly, again, very important that we work closely with Canada and Mexico in that lane.
I think you mentioned two pieces that I might touch on. Energy availability, energy affordability. That speaks to this idea of the demand outlook for energy across the trilateral. Looking within that trilateral, how do you see that energy demand evolving over the next coming years, and how does that almost catalyze the need for the United States, Canada, and Mexico to be thoughtful about how they can work together to meet their own energy demand?
Thank you, Reid. That, to me, is such a critical question because, look, energy demand is growing. And, at the end of the day, when you think about what are those economic drivers, whether it's population growth, whether it's the boom on AI and the data centers behind that needs that energy to support that growth, whether it's manufacturing and our supply chain issues, we're right now, we're not going to be able to meet that demand. And so we need to be able to prepare in advance to make sure we have the right production, that we have the capacity and absolutely the infrastructure behind it to meet that energy demand. So there's no doubt about it. Whether you look at IEA or EIA, the growth projections are there all across the globe, and we need to be able to be prepared so we're not relying on our adversaries or others when it comes to that energy need to meet that demand growth. And it's all here in the United States and in North America as a whole. And so, again, I just can't emphasize enough the fact that we need to be prepared on that. And I'll, again, emphasize the fact that when it comes to natural gas and the possibilities behind that, I think is tremendous. Nuclear is another area that I think could help with that growth, but it does take time to build. SMRs, though, is a great way to advance that in some ways or another, but will require, of course, investment, further investment opportunities. So, but yes, we need to find a way to meet that energy demand at the end of the day, and it's going to take a regional approach to do that.
So let's take that note on growing energy demand, and actually I'm going to move north to Canada and pull on Heather to kind of give us a sense of, when we talk about growing energy demand, the variability of that demand across different parts of the energy mix. Julia mentioned natural gas, fossil fuels in general, a major part of the natural resource base that Canada offers, but also when we're talking about raw materials, critical minerals, et cetera, Canada also has a role to play there. Heather, could you walk us through this similar question, but specifically for Canada? What is the role of Canada in a North American energy strategy, and what are the opportunities and challenges that you see to effectively enable Canada to contribute to that vision?
Yeah, happy to. And, as a Canadian, we're going through some hard days in DC, due to our NATO spending is not at par. But I get to be the one, I guess, talk about energy security, the place where we actually shine. So I have a great job to do today, is to talk about how integrated and how interdependent Canada and the United States is on energy. Not just oil, but refineries, pipelines, electricity, nuclear supply chain more and more. And how we need to start thinking, to Julia's point, we just take it for granted. We're not strategic with it. We don't have much planning, and yet it's so important. So even as the United States has become the world's largest producer of oil, it's never imported more from Canada. We had records actually this summer, 4.4 million barrels a day imported from Canada. We're about 60% of your imports now. And the reason for that is because the heavy, sour nature of Canadian crude fits very well with your refining system. And so you can export some of your light sweet that you have in excess. You still need to import some Canadian. And it's a huge part of our trade relationship, about $150 billion a year in our energy trade, also, and on top of that, $100 billion in mineral trade. So we're your largest supplier of oil, your only supplier of natural gas, your largest supplier of minerals, and your largest supplier of uranium. And the same could be said on the other side too, except for uranium. And so we are very interdependent and need to think of ways now, looking, for example, at Draghi's report on the European Union this week and highlighting, as he did, how their higher energy costs are such a competitive, headwind for them, that they don't have the energy abundance they have. And that's real impact on the competitiveness. A lot of our Asian allies would say the same. I think Canada, the United States, Mexico need to embrace that we have this abundance of resources of energy, the world's second and third biggest country. No one has the same level of energy independence as we do. And also think of ways to use it to help our allies, that we want to be strong as the West. We have enough. We should be friend-shoring. We should be strategic. And certainly the time for that is right now. Probably, it would have been better 5 or 10 years ago, but second best time is today.
Mm-hmm. And one of the elements you mentioned that this all really comes down to, whether it is electricity, whether it is oil and gas transport, this does come a little bit down to the availability of sufficient infrastructure to establish that connectivity. Could you talk us through a little bit of what does that infrastructure build out look like? What are the needs for additional infrastructure that we should be thinking about in order to more effectively connect Canada to the United States and by extension Mexico if we want to realize this idea of a North American energy superpower?
Well, the obvious ones are pipelines and transmission lines, and we could use more of those. And those are not easy to build. TC Energy would know better than most, the kind of stomach you have to try to build that kind of infrastructure across border. Even transmission lines from clean, Quebec Hydro, which you think would be a no-brainer, is like pulling teeth. And so making it easier, having, more security on the investment side of doing those kinds of things is a no-brainer. And then also building that pipeline for export capacity. Again, the Gulf of Mexico and the Canadian West Coast could ideally serve different markets. We aren't competing. What we really want to see, I think, is Western share take over authoritarian market share. Mm-hmm. And so there's no need for Canada, United States, and Mexico to compete. We very much want to displace other regimes. And I'll say, transmission pipelines are the obvious ones. But the critical mineral supply chain, we are a big source of raw materials. The United States is actually a huge miner also. Where we really fall down is on the processing and refining of those critical minerals. That's where we really are dependent on China, even on Russia for enriched uranium or titanium products. And so needing to collaborate with each other to figure out, okay, what are the raw materials we have, but also how and where are we going to start processing these so we can really be independent.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot to pull on there, but I do want to turn to our third member of the trilateral and turn to Dr. Diaz. Dr. Diaz, the same question I think we'll start out with. What do you see as Mexico's role in a North American energy strategy or a secure, trilateral on energy security issues, on competitiveness issues? Obviously, Mexico is part of this demand story, right? But it's also part of this really fascinating opportunity when you think about competitiveness in the context of nearshoring. So a lot to work with here. What do you see as the real role that Mexico can play in this idea?
So Mexico is a country that it is blessed with resources, natural resources. The richness of the supply base in Mexico is significant. Mexico has been a partner of the United States and Canada since they were negotiating NAFTA to try to integrate these markets. Unfortunately, the energy sector was put aside until the market was liberalized in 2013. We have seen incredible development of infrastructure and the development of renewables as a result of the opening of the market, attractiveness for Mexico, which under the AMLO administration has been subdued, but the resource is still there. And now with the nearshoring global trend, we see that Mexico is poised to increase manufacturing capacity for industrial and particularly automobile, the value chain, parts and actual assembly of vehicles. And that is going to require more energy. And energy is something that Mexico is poised to produce, but if it is to capitalize on that opportunity, it needs to rely on sources beyond what can produce domestically. And with that, I say, for example, one of the areas where we have not seen integration is in electricity markets. Very little connectivity there. And if we compare with the development of infrastructure and trade with Canada, we are very behind. And there is a huge opportunity there. There are hubs that have been developed, but the trade, the latest statistics I saw, they represent less than 1 or 2% of US energy demand, for example. And there could be tremendous gains for developing this infrastructure so that Mexico can increase the ability to meet that increase in energy demand in the northern states, for example, with clean energy demand from Texas, and also contribute, because there is a lot of opportunity for developing renewables in those states. And that would create a virtuous cycle for energy security, and also for capitalizing in this opportunity for increased manufacturing capacity in Mexico, bringing more economic development to the region, so that the region, along with Canada, grows in tandem.
And I think one of the threads I'd like to pull on that you mentioned here is this differentiation between the southern parts of Mexico, where you still see very baseline energy demand. You see gaps in baseline energy demand, and there's a concerted effort from AMLO as well as the incoming Sheinbaum administration to make sure that sufficient electricity, sufficient energy supplies are being delivered to the south. At the same time that you have significant nearshoring opportunities immediately, in the front of our noses in the northern provinces. As you said, that's partially a clean electricity conversation, but that's also a natural gas conversation. How do we think about, in the context of Mexico, balancing the clean electricity renewables build-out that I think that Mexico has ambitions for in the south, with the vast availability of gas-based interconnections in its northern provinces?
Yeah, so one of the things that we saw after the liberalization is that there was a focus on oil, because that was an industry where Mexico had already developed a strength, and it was easy to build on. Then you saw the need for natural gas, and that launched an unparalleled trend on investment. And TC came and invested in Mexico, developing all that infrastructure network that is required to bring that gas from the northern part, the industrial heart, to the south. And it has been a priority of various administrations in Mexico to integrate more the south part of the country, to bring industrial activity for economic reasons. And this is the reason why we see even the AMLO administration pushing for the development of greater connectivity on natural gas, because not only that will serve to bring imported gas to service new industrial activity, but also to connect its own domestic production, which they do have ambitions to monetize those reserves, and to connect with potential LNG export outlets, because there is an opportunity to service Asian demand competitively from the West. And what we need is all this infrastructure in place that allows the gas to flow freely from north to south, and to increase the scale of use and lower the prices. And that's what we need for competitiveness regionally, and particularly to bring competitiveness to the south of Mexico.
I do want to pull on this thread because I think it's a common thread from each of our panelists on this idea of, a North American energy strategy is not just a meeting domestic demand conversation. It's also a conversation about energy security outwards, right? How can North America be a force, use its own energy abundance as a force for foreign policy goals abroad by meeting the energy demands of its partners and allies, energy demand in Asia being one of them. Julia, I'd like for you to grapple with this first. How should we be thinking about energy security outwards as a foreign policy tool for the North American trilateral at this stage?
Absolutely, and that's what's so exciting right now with the building of an export terminal, LNG terminal, both in the western side of Canada as well as in Mexico, that will be able to at least meet the Asian energy demand, which we're seeing now more than ever, that growth also continuing. And of course, it certainly has a national security component also, because if you think about the great reliance on the Middle East right now, especially in countries like Qatar and throughout the region, and then also with Russia. I mean, Japan, for example, has heavily relied on Russian gas for quite some time as well. And so being able to support our allies abroad will be important, especially since we have that abundance here in North America. So it's certainly, I think, very important that these projects continue and can potentially expand since we have that capacity overall. There's always going to be challenges with the markets, of course, and again, considering the geopolitical impacts that it could have. So, but that's, I think, one big example of where, especially with Canada and Mexico, that they're able to support our allies abroad and meet those demands, especially if there is, another war. I mean, you look at China and Taiwan and what that can mean, or if there's unfortunately more devastation in the Middle East and what impact that could certainly have in that lane. So, and then I'd also add, when it comes to North America, there are certainly information sharing. There's the technology and innovation aspect of that, particularly in the nuclear industry, for example, too. Both Canada and the U.S. have great nuclear technology that could be shared as well. Globally, I know in Canada, Heather could speak to this, there's the CANDU reactors. Canada is one of the third largest producers of uranium. The U.S. has certain great SMR technology too that can expand. So being able to have that information sharing, the technology, the innovation, and even just from a commercial diplomacy standpoint, I think being able to really impact what we can do to share that from a commerce standpoint is important.
Yeah, and I think while the idea of the U.S. as an energy exporter has long permeated kind of the philosophy of U.S. foreign policy, I think increasingly, Heather, and I'll let you pick this question up here, I think those opportunities are very much starting to permeate the minds of Canadian policymakers and Canadian industry. So can you weigh in a little bit on how this idea of the opportunity of energy exports as a force as a foreign policy asset is starting to shape the way Canada is thinking about its role, not just in a North American energy trilateral, but possibly as an actor on the international energy stage?
Yeah, well, what's funny is that Canada is an enormous oil producer, exporter, natural gas producer, natural gas exporter. But we've only ever had one customer, the United States. So until TMX came online a couple months ago, the United States is getting about 96% of our oil exports, 99% of our natural gas exports. We have finally LNG Canada, our first LNG export terminal, is going to come online. So we're finally accessing global markets. I like to say we're finally moving from a regional exporter to a global exporter. And so it is funny that Canada, with all those resources, really hasn't been strategic or thought of its resources from a strategic perspective. It's been pretty happy just to deliver it to the United States, which we should continue to do. But the United States doesn't need it as much as it used to. And so we need to start looking at other markets. And the ones that Canada would displace, certainly is Russian supplies, number one. Just to point out, pick up where Julia left off. We're the number 2 exporter of uranium now, so I have to stick that in. We moved up a spot. But on the nuclear front, all these things, what I want to emphasize is we've been focusing a lot of our energy and climate policy on renewables with supply chains that China has come to dominate, and very strategically. You know, their new trio, the lithium-ion batteries, the solar panels, the EVs. And I think North America needs to look very strongly at what are our strengths, what do we have in abundance, and start leveraging those. And so we do have natural gas in abundance. So let's think about LNG, let's think about carbon capture, let's think about hydrogen. We have uranium in abundance, let's think about nuclear. Let's think of using the resources that we have rather than having, you know, kind of twist into a pretzel and figure out how to, you know, source new supplies from 20 different countries to replace what China's been able to dominate.
I do want to use this opportunity, though, to pick up on what you've mentioned, and I think what's been mentioned by Julia as well as Dr. Diaz here, which is, you know, the new resource base that is evolving as a result of energy transition is its own foreign policy battleground. And while we've spent a lot of time thus far talking about, you know, how do you enable the North American trilateral to, you know, be a force for energy security through its hydrocarbon exports, developing the linkages in the mineral supply chain it requires some new ground to be laid. What do you see as the forecast for really catalyzing deeper partnership for between the United States, Mexico, and Canada with its upstream resources in mineral supply chains, beyond just saying, hey, Canada has a lot of these rocks in the ground, let's get them out and build cool supply chains?
Yeah, I would start with saying we have a lot of rocks in the ground because I think people would be surprised. You know, we talk about critical minerals. It's on top of everyone's mind. It's in everyone's, you know, foreign policies. The market is still not good. There is still not a lot of new money coming into any kind of minerals. Copper and gold are doing okay. A lot of the other ones are doing poorly. China has been manipulating the market, specifically not to let things like lithium, cobalt, graphite, rare earths, and other parts get off the ground. And so number one is, you know, is what is the demand forecast? And this is where it gets tricky. We say we want these things for batteries and for the energy transition. You know, we needed all this lithium, and now look at the EV market. You know, it's very unpredictable. It's not as high as people thought. That kind of irrational exuberance is dying down. So knowing where to pick and choose where we should be investing in mines for security purposes is a little bit tricky. But really, like I say, the processing. And it's hard to move processing from China or from some other suppliers because it's expensive and it's dirty and it's labor intensive. And those are not our competitive advantages. Maybe Mexico has some competitive agenda on the labor side, but we really need to think through what does it mean to start friendshoring, onshoring these processing elements. And I haven't seen that discussion happening. And I'm sure maybe we'll get to the topic of stockpiles. But that would be, you know, one strategy to think about. How do we correct for the fact that the market is not delivering the investment in critical minerals that we think it should be?
Mm-hmm. I think we mentioned Mexico, so I want you to weigh in on this idea, whether that be on the idea of Mexico's role in a energy security outward sort of approach, or recognizing the value of energy security out for foreign policy goals, or this idea of where can Mexico plug into a nearshoring strategy, whether that be through its own labor force, any number of these other attributes that Mexico does bring to this table, despite not having a lot of the domestic resources itself.
Mexico does have some of those critical minerals that are in high demand today, graphite, magnesium. It is already a provider of the United States. The challenge is to increase the production and to do so in a way that is environmentally responsible. And because of that, I salute the United States with its initiative for critical minerals, the partnership, that it is seeking to align throughout the hemisphere the policies and the opportunities from bringing investment into these countries. And one of the focuses of the partnership is Mexico, not only because of the labor cost advantage that you mentioned, but the fact that Mexico is an unexplored market for mineral production. And they have tremendous reserves of lithium. They have high expectations on that. About a month ago, I had the pleasure to speak with representatives, incoming representatives to state legislatures in Mexico in the northern states. And they were asking a lot about what are the mechanisms, opportunities, and kind of the protocols that the United States has in place to think about critical mineral value chains throughout the hemisphere. So there is a lot of interest already from these legislators in figuring out how to harmonize the policies, how to bring the incentives that are required for greater production of these minerals. I would also say that that translates into, and also includes semiconductors. And Mexico has been identified as a place where you could boost the production, the assembly, the test, and packaging of semiconductors. And we saw the State Department announcing an initiative, I think it was in July, focused on Mexico, I think Panama and Costa Rica, for semiconductors to align the incentives, as well as figuring out, for example, the basic information you need to have. What are the gaps that are in human capital, on talent, which is the advantage of Mexico, that can be remediated with collaboration via universities, via training centers, via the laboratories in the United States. So we see progress there. And I believe that those are sectors that the incoming Sheinbaum administration is focusing as well. So there is some alignment there because there is an opportunity that needs to be capitalized on.
You mentioned capitalizing on that alignment, and I'm building off of a question from our audience, which, by the way, if you would like to ask a question, please use askac.org, and you'll see the opportunity to ask questions pop up right on your screen. But when we talk about nearshoring and leveraging the domestic attributes of Mexico, human capital, a very strong and deep labor pool being one of them. A consistent thread we heard over the course of the summer was some of the inroads that Chinese manufacturing had made into Mexico. I tend to look at this less of a, hey, how do we limit what some are calling the Chinese backdoor, but rather, how can the United States and Canada capitalize on the Sheinbaum administration's interest in being a productive partner to more effectively create a trilateral nearshored supply chain that is insulated and competitive, absent any activity that China might be doing on its own in Mexico. What is your thought on how we grapple with that particular issue?
You're asking a professor that believes in the power of policy and rules. So my answer would be the easiest way to do this would be to have a really strict accounting on carbon. Yeah? Mm-hmm. If you have a policy taking advantage that Mexico has the structure of an ETS already, that this administration is expected to take advantage on, to issue the rules, the operational rules to see what sectors it will cover, you could basically have a carbon border adjustment. And that would be the best way to figure out what's the carbon footprint of a product and whether it has been produced cleanly locally. So I would say that would be the ideal scenario.
It goes back to this idea, one of the things that we touched on in this report we just released, that the emissions, the relative emissions footprint of energy and industry on the North American continent is much lower than some of its peers, and whether it's from renewables, whether it's from low emission natural gas, the continent should embrace that as part of an industrial strategy. And so what you're saying, I'm hearing from you, is that the United States, Canada, and Mexico can lean into that a bit more in order to establish a competitive advantage against China, who has value chains which at times are much less transparent in the upstream, much dirtier, much higher emission in the upstream, and that might unstick some of this through policy. Is that I'm understanding you correctly there?
Yes, That's correct. I mean, I think that what we see right now is that in order to really tackle the climate challenge, you need to have new trade tools and a new trade strategy so that you can actually tilt the balance toward cleaner goods, green goods. And the way to do that in an organized manner is to make sure that you have a clear accounting of emissions on each good production. That way, you will actually elevate the capacity of these three countries to integrate their policies. Canada already has a carbon tax and ETS that works at the federal level. They have been talking about a carbon border adjustment responding to the European Union. That is a talk that is being held or had here in the United States. And Mexico has already made strides in creating this ETS. So I think that the pillars are there, and we just need to figure out a way to push it forward, and it will help.
Yep. Julie.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an excellent point. At the end of the day, we're looking at, especially in the United States, any type of decarbonization efforts that I think the tools that could be used with Mexico, of course, as a close partner, as well as Canada. You talked about the sustainability, of course, and the carbon footprint, which is extremely important. But I just wanted to also highlight the fact that as well as cost, is also there's even a human rights aspect to this too, especially with China. So we can't underestimate, while they may have such a presence in Mexico, considering what is happening back in China from that standpoint, from a capital standpoint, and again, all the more advantage why Mexico would be so much better and more critical when it comes to manufacturing and nearshoring from that standpoint. So it's such a number of elements, including a national security standpoint too, intellectual property rights. I mean, it can go down the list of all the challenges with China from that standpoint, and all the more reason why this North America partnership is such a critical aspect.
Heather, I want to actually bring you in on this conversation as we talk about advantaging relatively lower emission industries, energy production, et cetera, from the continent. Lily mentioned, Canada's ETS. Your reflection on this idea and whether or not it can be viably translated into making the continent more competitive, as it also wades into a global climate discussion that is becoming increasingly concerned with the role of emissions in trade.
Yeah, well, I mean, Canada's had a carbon price. Alberta's had an industrial carbon price since 2007 on its oil and gas industry. And it's been very effective. It's one of the very few effective climate policies for actually reducing emissions, which of course is the point. And so I think there's generally welcomeness for these kinds of measures because, we feel like it's painful on the competitive side. If you could have something that actually rewards the carbon pricing and the efforts made there, that would be very good. And Canada in general is very competitive on the emissions intensity of any number of commodities from agriculture, metals, processing. And I'll just shout this out because, the oil sands are a heavier emitting product for sure, but all heavy oils are. And so if you look at Canada compared to other competitor heavy oils, especially South Americans, then we actually don't do too bad. So you would have to replace Canadian oil sands, which is heavy emitting, with something else that's even more heavy emitting. And so if we could just compare apples to apples, I think we'd be okay there. And just to Julia's point, I just want to point out, there's the carbon intensity and the carbon-based measures, but the security aspect too. And if you ask me, tariffs on China are security premiums, that we are giving friendly sources that space to compete with China and, its unfair practices. And so I think using those tariffs strategically, this is time where national security is going to take preeminence over economic aspects. It just is. And so I think that's a good way to value what is the security premium of these various things.
Mm-hmm. We have about 20 minutes left, and I am getting a number of questions in the chat about, I think, the elephant in the room, which is this idea of the number of elections that are happening across the trilateral. Obviously, in June, we had elections in Mexico. We're in the middle of a wonderful democratic process here in the United States. And then I think at some point over the next 8 to 12 months, we'll see elections in Canada. I think, Dr. Diaz, I'll start with you. A two-part question, ultimately. Your reflections first on Claudia Sheinbaum's approach to these ideas that we've been discussing, nearshoring, leveraging the benefits for foreign policy of energy exports, even amidst some pretty robust energy demand questions in the southern states of Mexico, but also what the opportunities are for further regulatory engagement with the United States and Canada on energy issues as we approach a USMCA period. And kind of at the part two to that question is, recognizing some of the constitutional reform proposals that have been rapidly developing over the past 24, 48 hours, especially some of those proposals possibly introducing a little bit more uncertainty in the future in terms of the future of those USMCA negotiations. How should we package all of this in the context of our discussion around a North American energy strategy?
So I would say that there is a lot of uncertainty still, but I like to be optimistic and positive about it. And I would say that if we read the recent developments and decisions from the Sheinbaum's administration on who to appoint to key energy institutions, we see a bias for technical aspects, technocrats, a bias for people who can't infuse the institutions with knowledge on how to bring financial stability. That's a priority. And people knowledgeable of energy and climate, not only energy, but climate. And so if we look at the appointment at CNR, we have a technocrat that knows a lot about economics and finance, doesn't have much of a background in energy, but has clearly voiced a desire to develop renewable energy resources. Mm-hmm. And that is probably going to focus on advancing that while maintaining the policy direction that President-elect Sheinbaum has given, which is we are going to continue investing in our energy security and sovereignty. So you probably will see a very carefully crafted energy strategy going forward that is going to balance these two objectives. Mm-hmm. Furthering the incorporation of renewable energy while maintaining energy security as paramount. If you see the appointment to the first woman to lead the state electricity utility, you see that it's somebody who knows very well the institution, 30 years working at CFE, somebody who is technical in nature, and somebody who also has said we need to transition. We need to incorporate renewables. So second person speaking about the primacy of incorporating renewables as a strategy for diversification while maintaining the bias of state-centric authority and control. And the third appointment is at Pemex. And this is a person who brings a background on energy economics. Again, a technical person that is brought to Pemex to try to find financial stability. That's pivotal for Mexico's oil and gas development going forward. And it's a person who not only has voiced this objective of financial instability, but has also said, I do want to see higher production of oil and gas, but cleaner fuels as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an objective, and development of renewable energy resources. So while we are going to have some policy continuity, particularly the first year, I have hope that we will see the Sheinbaum administration moving towards that stated goal of substantive investment in the development of renewables, almost $13 billion expected by 2030 to meet a very ambitious goal of incorporating 80 gigawatts of clean energy. And this is because all the investment that is coming to Mexico to service the US market on automaking and semiconductors and critical minerals and manufacturing in general will require clean energy. And so you see that. I think that I don't have enough information to tell you much about the recent changes to the legislation. I would be remiss to give an opinion. This is a public record. But I would say that what that gives you is an idea of what a majority can do. Yeah? They were able to pass the judicial overhaul, the rules, and it means that there is potential for further reform. During the AMLO administration, some of the proposals put forward roll back some of the liberalization efforts. So that creates a lot of uncertainty. It is unclear whether Mrs. Sheinbaum will consider the same proposals as a priority for her, given her stated plan for renewable energy development and actually increase in investment throughout the sector. I would tend to think that she is going to be very practical. The state-owned companies are in a difficult position financially. And to accomplish all these lofty goals, you need to be practical and realistic, and you may necessitate down the road the participation of the private sector. And in order to do so, you need to provide legal stability and certainty.
I might first, so a follow-up to your question, because you covered a lot of ground, and understanding that there is a fair amount of uncertainty, but when you look in the aggregate of these appointments that have been made in the early days of the Sheinbaum administration, when you look at the power of the majority that you articulated, and you look to almost the need case for what tools and strategies the Sheinbaum administration will need to engage with in order to meet its domestic and international energy goals, would you say that at least the line is trending upwards towards a Mexico that is eager to be much more welcome to private investment than it possibly has been previously?
I would say yes. And one of the things that I interpret as a signal to that is that, for example, CFE has been one of the most difficult players in the energy sector, the electricity sector. And the new incoming CEO seems to be a less ideological person, far more practical, technocratic. And so I think that is going to make a difference, at least for the perception of investment and investors on risk, and who are they dealing with. And even for the capacity to service CFE as a service provider, not necessarily as an investor. For example, there is a tremendous opportunity to help Mexico increase the deployment of smart grid technologies. It's necessary for them to deal with the problems that they have with outages. And Canada has an enviable market rate penetration of smart grids, 80%, meaning that they have an entire ecosystem that they have built to service that market. Same with the United States, very advanced technology, hardware, software. That's in need in Mexico, and we can service CFE if they have the resources, and that there is collaboration, and then there is technical support from neighbors.
Let's continue on this thread of elections. I'm going to skip the United States and go to Canada for a minute. Heather, elections in Canada are on the horizon, right? What do you see? We don't know precisely when they will happen. We assume they'll be at some point next year. But where do you see the electoral landscape in Canada possibly shaping, shifting, or pivoting the way Canada might want to engage with this idea of a North American trilateral on energy specifically?
Yeah, great question. I don't want to wade into American elections at all, but I just want to note this Biden tweet about 3 weeks ago. We want to increase our oil production. We have increased our oil production without delaying the transition. We are America. We can do both. And I just want to note that around the world, including the United States, the difference between what people were saying in 2020 and what people are saying in 2024 about energy and energy security and climate. And for me, it's been a shift to pragmatism. And I want to highlight that there's not been that shift to pragmatism with the Trudeau Liberal government, that they are, depending on your perspective, just as ambitious or just as ideological on climate policy as they've been for a long time. And it's been detrimental to resource and energy development for sure. So, even things in critical minerals, we've had stricter regulatory laws. Graphite, nickel, cobalt are down 40% since 2012. Production of those, copper is down 10%. Still very little rare earths or lithium production. We've had pipelines rejected, LNG export terminal rejected. And so there is optimism from the resource sector that the next government, the Conservatives have been leading by about 20 points, for about a year. So it feels very much like it's tail end of the current Liberal government, that they will be more friendly to the resource sector. And so it's a question of markets. What is the market appetite for that? How much is it within federal control rather than provincial or Indigenous control of how fast these things go? And then also questions, though, on the climate policy side, that there hasn't been a conservative climate policy. They have not been forthcoming. It has not been a priority of their base, perhaps maybe similar to the United States. And so a question of what are we going to do when many governments in Europe and North America and elsewhere go towards the right? No one wants to see, industry doesn't want to see, the resource sector doesn't want to see the pendulum shifting so far left and then so far right. We all want to see it find some place in the center with some sensible, pragmatic climate and energy policy. And so far, Canada is not finding a center as far as I can see.
Julia, I'm going to ask you to carry a lot of water right now and cover the role of U.S. elections in this space, which I think are fascinating because despite the polarization that we see on either side of the aisle with regard to the future direction of the country, certain thematics run true throughout both candidates. We see ideas around economic competitiveness, ideas around managing inflation. Even just last night during the debate, we saw Vice President Harris characterize energy production in the context of diversification and energy security away from foreign suppliers of that energy. It appears that a North American energy strategy fits within whatever outcome we might see in November, but with marginal changes on either side. What is your outlook to how the election in literally just a few weeks from now will shape how we think about a North American energy strategy?
Yeah, no, it's sometimes very difficult to weed out some of the rhetoric that you tend to hear, especially in an election year. Having served in multiple administrations, it's interesting because you start to see the same themes popping up, energy diversification, not relying on a single source, learning from the lessons of not just the current Russia-Ukraine crisis, but even in the past when Russia cut off gas to Ukraine and what the impacts it could have on U.S. markets and the rest of the world. I think there's a shared theme there. Interesting. It's how it's communicated and what are the priorities that come, job creation, unleashing, American dominance on energy, especially in the private sector. I think our biggest challenge, no matter what the result of the elections are, is really the regulatory process. If we want to meet that energy demand, we want to have the capacity, we want to have the infrastructure behind it. To do so, we've got to, not kick ourselves in the rear, so to speak, and try to help when it comes to permitting reform, for example, and being able to kind of allow companies to go forth and build, particularly in North America, with North American companies, both domestically and internationally. But it becomes a challenge, I think, in the regulatory piece of this, and I think it'll be a challenge for either administration, even past November, and how we look at that, how we look at those regulations. I've got a team right now looking at everything from the Natural Gas Act to the EPA's Good Neighbor rule on clean air and so forth. I mean, there's so many different developments, and some of them, of course, are important to understand, but we're really going to have to really weed that out and understand how we can build on productionists. And I think, again, it goes back to natural gas and LNG to be able to meet that demand. And I think either side of the aisle is going to have to be able to understand that. I think it is a horrible challenge right now with regards to having this LNG pause, for example. I think if it were a Trump administration, they would lift it on day one. I hope if it was a Harris administration, that would be something that they would understand that cannot be sustainable in the long term, as an example. So it is an interesting time to see that, but again, when it comes to the principles behind energy security, energy transition, it has to come at the end of the day to be affordable. That, when it comes to the economy and inflation issues today, it is very much tied into that. And we won't go into the national security aspect of it, but energy is the lifeblood of any economy, and we have to be able to address those issues. But think about that everyday family who needs to put food on the table, the agricultural industry, the water issues, especially even in Mexico too. It all ties in together, and so it's such a complicated, complex system. And while politics is politics, as leaders, and that's why I think it's so important to have a public-private sector partnership. You can't rely completely on government, but it can also just be the private sector, and so we have to ensure those policies are in place. And again, it is an interesting time on that. And I think, we've got to see some bipartisanship along the way.
One question, and after this, we will have to wrap ourselves up briefly. But Heather, we do have a question, a really important question from our audience, which is understanding that we just spoke a few minutes ago about the direction of national Canadian elections as it relates to a North American energy strategy. But energy, fundamentally in Canada, is under the jurisdiction of the various provinces. So how do we fold in Alberta, Manitoba, British Columbia into our thinking around building a North American energy strategy effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, the province that has been the linchpin or the bottleneck, depending on how you want to look at it, has been British Columbia. Very progressive, very ambitious climate policies, but is the market access for a lot of Alberta oil for anything that doesn't go south. And so building pipelines in British Columbia. They also have tremendous world-class natural gas reserves, trying to use that as feedstock for LNG. So getting, British Columbia to accept LNG even, and BC LNG is going to be the lowest emitting LNG in the world. And part of it is because they have hydroelectricity to use for the liquefaction process. And so certainly is displacing either higher emitting LNG or coal, but it's been very difficult and a lack of public support. So I'm bringing this up because they have an election next month. And if you had, it's neck and neck. If the Conservatives won in BC and then the Conservatives won federally, Alberta will still have a Conservative government. You'd be unlocking a lot of regulatory and political will to expand Canadian energy exports for sure. Mm-hmm.
So with our last minute, and I do want to do one quick round robin for a final comment from each of you, starting with you, Dr. Diaz. And I think if I could get each of you to reflect on where we are headed with these ideas around a North American energy strategy, particularly with the review of USMCA in 2026 on the horizon. How do we think about engaging more productively on energy at the same time that we are revisiting the trilateral's relationship across any number of other trade and investment priorities? It's a big question. I'm going to make we're each going to have to wrap up on that piece, but I'll start with you.
I think that one priority will be to for Mexico to start thinking strategically along with the United States and Canada as a region again. Yeah, there is a lot of opportunity to unlock, and Mexico already has seen what nearshoring can do for its economy. And again, I go back to my idea that in order to capitalize on that opportunity, Mexico needs to align in a strategic fashion with how the United States and Canada are moving towards energy security and climate policies that are driven by this desire of creating clean value chains. Mexico needs to be part of that.
Heather, we'll go to you. What does the road to USMCA review look like? How do we make sure that energy doesn't get tripped up as we, or we maximize the opportunity from energy as we begin that process?
I'll say I don't know of any Canadians looking forward to CUSMA, as we would call it, renegotiations. It looks a lot like a lot of potential downside and a lot of potential upside. And I would say that the one lever that we have going into renegotiations, for example, with the Trump administration, is our energy and resource interdependence with the United States. And to make sure we're providing that, I think, you know, we need to start having an energy abundance mindset. If we have an energy scarcity mindset amongst the West, there'll be crabs in a bucket, there'll be infighting. I don't think we'll be maximizing our potential. If we have an energy abundance mindset, then we're really going to compete with, competition from authoritarian regimes. So recognizing the value that Canada has, and Canada recognizing that that is, you know, a critical area where we do provide value to the continent, to the Western Alliance, is going to be key for us.
Julie, I'll let you close.
Yeah.
Where are we headed?
Well, it is unclear right now, as we start to think about USMCA review, particularly in 2026. But that being said, I think, as Heather mentioned, energy is is where we could really move the needle. And again, as we talk about this case for North American Energy Cooperation, reminding ourselves that North America is the powerhouse when it comes to that cooperation for the energy sector that affects all these different buckets of the economy, of national security, inflation issues, but at the same time, that regional cooperation, to me, is so critical, and that will set us apart. You think about, you've got the EU, you've got ASEAN, you've got all these different other regional cooperations happening around the world. Why can't North America lead on that effort? And we have such an advantage when it comes to the abundance of clean energy that can both, again, be affordable, that can be secure, reliable, and sustainable. So great opportunities that we have here. If we can just really hone in on that partnership, I think it will set us up for success.
I think that's a great way to end it. So with that, we're 2 minutes over time. I have production giving me the evil eye. So I'd like to thank our panelists and thank Heather for joining us virtually for a really enjoyable conversation. This is an area that I think the Atlantic Council and the Global Energy Center will continue to be engaged on, because this is just the first part of a very long road to thinking about how energy can be a uniting force for good across the trilateral, both internally but also externally, because we're addressing so many of these problems together, whether we like it or not. So with that, thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.